Welcome back to Klepper's Corner Today in History. May 13th is one of those dates where humanity walks into a crisis, claims it has a plan, and calls the mess a tradition, a nation, or a breakthrough. Today we've got ghosts bribed with beans, continents named by branding, and empires doing paperwork with cannons. Segment 1, and the dead keep better calendars than the living. In ancient Rome, May 13th wrapped up the Lemuria, a household ritual for driving restless spirits out of the home, because even the dead apparently needed a midnight eviction process. The head of the household walked barefoot through the dark, tossed black beans over his shoulder, refused to look back, and repeated a formula 9 times, which is either religion or the first customer service call with Comcast. The logic was simple. Ghosts were hungry, beans were available, and Rome had not yet invented therapy. So a father in a hallway became night manager of the afterlife. Under the theater, though, was a society trying to process grief, violence, bad burials, and the awful suspicion that the past does not stay politely behind you. Centuries later, May 13th turned spiritual again with Julian of Norwich, a plague-era Englishwoman who nearly died, saw visions of divine love, recovered, and eventually wrote the earliest surviving English-language book by a woman. That is a strong literary resume. Nearly die, receive cosmic reassurance, then move into a wall the side of church like a medieval advice column with stone insulation. In 1981, Pope John Paul II was shot in St. Peter's Square on May 13th, the anniversary of the first Fatima apparition, which he took as a sign that Mary guided the bullet away from his vital organs. Across these stories, the date keeps asking what people do when death barges in. Rome throws beans, Julian writes hope from a cell, and John Paul forgives his attacker. Apparently, humanity's emergency plan is half ritual, half mercy, and one very uncomfortable hallway walk. Segment 2, and the new world gets a branding consultant. May 13th also launches people toward places they do not fully understand, which is history's preferred way of creating problems with confident maps. In 1501, Amerigo Vespucci sailed from Lisbon under the Portuguese flag to explore the Western lands. And unlike Columbus, he looked at the evidence and thought, wait a minute, this is not Asia wearing a different hat. Vespucci helped Europeans understand they were dealing with a separate landmass. And because his letters spread like Renaissance clickbait, a later mapmaker put America on the page. So an entire hemisphere was named not for the people already living there, and not even for the first European to stumble into it, but for the guy with the better newsletter. Then, on May 13, 1607, English colonists chose the site for Jamestown, selecting a swampy peninsula because it was defensible, had deep water for ships, and looked safe from Spanish attack. Basically, they picked the colonial equivalent of a cheap apartment with good parking and a mysterious smell. The Powhatan people had avoided the place for practical reasons, like mosquitoes, brackish water, and not wanting to live in a disease buffet. But the Virginia Company was chasing gold, a Pacific route, and optimism so aggressive it should have needed a permit. By May 13, 1787, Britain was launching the first fleet toward Australia, solving overcrowded prisons by shipping convicts to the other side of the planet and calling it strategy. These events share one pattern. Powerful people rename places, redraw futures, and describe displacement as opportunity. The map always looks tidy. The people living inside it usually have notes. Segment 3, and empire discovers the passive voice. When empires want something, they rarely say, we would like to take that. They say supply routes, border security, civilization, national honor, or any phrase that makes conquest sound like a zoning meeting. On May 13th, 1110, King Baldwin I's Crusader forces captured Beirut after a brutal siege backed by Genoese ships, turning a fortified coastal city into a warning label for the Levant. The strategic explanation was control of ports and shipping. The human reality was a population trapped between armored infantry and the naval blockade, with escape routes slammed shut like history's ugliest toll booth. Later that year, Sidon surrendered, partly because Beirut had already shown what resistance could cost, which is medieval marketing through trauma. Then, on May 13, 1846, the United States declared war on Mexico, after President James K. Polk claimed American blood had been shed on American soil, even though the spot, as Abraham Lincoln would later needle him, sat in territory both countries claimed and Mexico considered its own. Polk wanted California and New Mexico. The border incident gave him the headline. It is amazing how often destiny waits around until somebody can format it into a press release. In 1943, May 13th brought another military turn when Axis forces surrendered in Tunisia, ending the North African campaign and opening the way towards Sicily and Italy. That victory helped crack open the Mediterranean, but it also showed that empires can get trapped by their own momentum. The same geography people chase for power can become the cage they cannot escape. May 13th reminds us that maps are not just drawings. Sometimes they are confessions with borders. Segment 4, and freedom arrives with a receipt. Some dates celebrate liberation, but May 13th keeps adding an asterisk big enough to require its own constitution. In 1830, leaders in Quito declared separation from Gran Colombia and created the Republic of Ecuador, ending another piece of Simón Bolívar's dream of a unified South American republic. The new country was born from real regional frustration, but it inherited the old problems: rivalry between Quito and Guayaquil, military strongmen, elite politics, and indigenous people treated not as citizens with rights, but as a population to be supervised. That is one of history's cruelest tricks. Independence can change the flag before it changes the power structure. In Brazil, on May 13, 1888, Princess Isabel signed the Lei Áurea, abolishing slavery in the last country in the Western Hemisphere still legally protecting it. Slavery was abolished, all contrary provisions revoked, and millions of formerly enslaved people were expected to enter freedom with no land, no compensation, no education plan, and no apology large enough to pay rent. It was liberation written like a cancellation notice. Then, in France, on May 13, 1958, settlers and military officers in Algiers helped collapse the Fourth Republic and bring Charles de Gaulle back to power, expecting him to save French Algeria. Instead, he eventually moved toward Algerian independence, and the forces that elevated him turned on him. The pattern is brutal. People summon a strongman to freeze history in place, then act shocked when he reads the room better than they do. Freedom arrives, but it brings debts, contradictions, and all the people the ceremony forgot to invite. Segment 5, and modernity puts on a helmet. By the 20th century, May 13th starts looking painfully modern. Speeches, machines, crowds, cameras, and systems moving faster than the people inside them can process. On May 13, 1940, Winston Churchill gave his first speech as British Prime Minister, offering blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Still one of history's greatest examples of managing expectations by removing every pleasant option. Britain was staring at Nazi Germany's blitzkrieg. France was collapsing, and Churchill did not promise comfort. He promised a national root canal with better rhetoric. That same day, Igor Sikorsky flew the VS-300 untethered in Connecticut, proving the modern helicopter design after decades of obsession and failure. One May 13th gives us a leader trying to keep a democracy upright. The other gives us a machine that can hover, rescue, transport, and make every action movie louder. In 1950, the first Formula One World Championship race ran at Silverstone, turning a former bomber airfield into a cathedral of speed, money, danger, and men in tiny cars treating the laws of physics like suggestions from committee. And on May 13, 1989, students in Tiananmen Square began a hunger strike, transforming a protest into a national and international crisis under the eyes of the world's media. They used visibility as protection, hoping cameras would make power behave. Instead, the humiliation of being watched hardened the government's response. That is the dark edge of modernity. Attention can expose injustice, but it cannot always stop a tank. May 13th gives us courage in a speech, lift in a machine, speed on a track, and students risking their bodies because sometimes the only thing left to spend is yourself. In conclusion, May 13th is full of people negotiating with forces bigger than themselves. Ghosts, oceans, empires, borders, machines, crowds, and governments that would prefer nobody ask follow-up questions. The costumes change and the technology gets louder, but the pattern stays familiar. Human beings keep building systems to control fear, and then history shows up barefoot in the hallway, throwing beans over its shoulder, whispering, "Good luck with that."